So, ordinarily, this is a show where we fact check the heroic stories that the famously wealthy dictate on their own or pay PR firms to spin on their behalf. We comb through the resources we're able to find and put our subjects on crutches, which is our PR torture test acronym. C stands for consumer harm, R stands for rich parents, U stands for union suppression and employee abuse, T stands for tax evasion and taxpayer dependence. The second C stands for child labor and child harm. H stands for harassment allegations. E stands for egregious behavior after hours. And S stands for slap suits and journalist suppression. Because of logistics, this week it was hard for us both to get together, so I'm recording this one as a Rad Bill Loosey. Money Mike will be with us on the next one. I'll miss him dearly, as I always do when we don't get to record together. I'm Rad Bill. Oh, the vacuum. Deep space. Anyways. This is from Jesus is the people. So, our U.S. listeners are probably pretty accustomed to hearing about China. How China's taking over the world. How they're suddenly struggling economically. How they're taking over the world again. But wait, an economic crisis? Never mind, they're still taking over the world. But if you're like me, you're probably taking this with some grain of salt. They're the nation in second place on the global stage, and they're gaining on us. I will not be motivated to hate another nation because they're on their way to outclassing my own. And to some degree, I'm sure this sentiment is correct. Though they are one of, if not our largest trading partner, they are the enemy because they seek to be better than we are. However, there's another reason to be concerned about China's growing dominance, and though they're gaining a reputation for this behavior, it's hard to stop from the outside. You see, developing nations don't like superpowers in general, and for good reason. A nice little isolated incident we can hone in on that sort of sets the rule and kind of gives an overarching narrative here is what happened to Ecuador over the last 25, 30 years or so. Ecuador's president, Rafael Correa, built a lasting relationship with China around the time Bush was in office. As part of China's new Belt and Road Initiative, the rapidly growing country invested billions in Ecuador, allowing the nation to build schools, more than double the minimum wage, enact social programs, and lift 1 million people out of poverty. China also agreed to lend the small nation money for construction of a dam and miles of pipelines and oil infrastructure, which would allow Ecuador to become an oil exporter instead of a crude exporter, which is big. Now, all this sounds great, but here's the catch. China said they'd agree to lend the money so long as Chinese companies were hired to do the work. That was a sore spot for Ecuadorians, perfectly capable of doing the work on their own and more familiar with the land on which these projects were taking place. But at the end of the day, self-sufficiency was an end worth making some sacrifices for. Now, as an outsider, I may care more about the region's ecology, and I have less skin in the game in insisting on preserving it than poor locals do who want to build something for themselves. But the work that Chinese contractors completed took place in one of the most fragile environments on Earth, at the base of the Amazon River, and it wasn't great work. In the years after the projects were completed, oil pipelines ruptured, polluting waterways feeding the Amazon River. The reservoir that China built for Ecuador clogged, and the generator building quickly filled with cracks. Despite the fact that almost none of the energy infrastructure wound up working long-term, though, Ecuador still had to pay back that loan to China, all $19 billion of it. Because they couldn't afford the payments, China laid claim to the rights to 80% of Ecuador's crude oil. Now, I don't hear this cited that often by nationalists in the U.S. trying to stoke resentment of China, and I think that's for one of two reasons. Number one, that person is dumb enough to be a nationalist. Or number two, if that person is informed, they're well aware that we've been doing what China's doing here for the better part of a century. You see, Rafael Correa made that agreement with China to escape a massive bill owed to U.S. companies. The U.S. had beat China to the task of decimating Ecuador by almost 50 years at this point. Ambassadors for construction companies in the U.S. went and promised incredible prosperity to the nation, which had been governed for years by oligarchs and easily corruptible tyrants who quickly signed on the dotted line, setting into motion the construction of hydroelectric dams, transmission and distribution systems, roads, and industrial parks, all of which were deliciously lucrative for the American companies doing the work. However, Ecuador's economic boom was not as great as predicted, and before long, the obligation on the loans made to the country by the World Bank to do all this work became too great of a burden for the small nation. When the country defaulted, it was forced to forfeit the collateral on the loan, access to the country's vast oil reserves. The right to these oil reserves were then sold to Texaco for next to nothing. Now, this sounds like a disaster, but this outcome, believe it or not, was carefully engineered. Here's how it worked, and here's how this system has worked across the globe. A high-income nation gets word of oil or some other scarce resource in a region without the means or political will to capitalize on those resources. The high-income nation then sends specialists who at one point literally identified themselves as economic hitmen to these developing countries to identify economic potential and convince leadership to accept the quote-unquote help of the wealthy country in the form of a loan for the amount necessary to realize all of this potential. A few conditions are typically present. Number one, those resources the high-income nation recognized go up as collateral for these loans. Number two, the money is loaned to them under the condition that it be used to hire companies based in the higher income nation. Now, the second stipulation does a few things. It enriches businesses in the wealthy country and aligns theirs with the interests of their government, which is key. The U.S. government can't go in and take the resources it so desperately wants from wherever it wants to take them. It's too messy. But under this arrangement, they can look to the private sector to lead the charge by enriching themselves. Hey, big multinational, if you send someone to this country to make economic justifications for an enormous loan by the World Bank, we'll make it a condition of the loan's underwriting that they hire your company to do the work. Now, for an ordinary loan, the lender is going to be pretty careful about assessing the value proposition because they want to make their money back. But here, the World Bank isn't as concerned. In fact, they want to lend too much because they want the recipient of these funds to default. When these nations finally do default, the debt must be settled to whatever degree possible. First, by forfeiting what was offered as collateral, in the case of Ecuador, their oil reserves. Then by selling mineral reserves, the rights to ports, canals, whatever else they can sell, at a massive discount. Now, if selling these for rock-bottom prices doesn't reconcile the owed amount, the country is forced to adopt austerity measures, deregulating markets, slashing pay for federal workers, providing tax breaks to corporations, the whole shebang. Now, make no mistake, the World Bank isn't chalking up losses in the wake of these default events. Over the last 3 decades, while, quote, working for a world free of poverty, unquote, the World Bank has lent $540 billion to 60 of the poorest countries on earth. Since then, these countries have paid $550 billion in principal and interest and still owe $523 billion. The cost of servicing this debt is 20 times what these countries receive in foreign aid and far more than they spend on education or healthcare. So, everyone, including the World Bank, gets rich. The U.S. nationalizes valuable resources, and the impoverished target of this campaign is decimated. Cost of doing business. Ecuador was one of the earliest victims of this behavior. Again, the U.S. campaign in the region goes back to the 60s. Ironically, the World Bank, a massive tool in the predatory arsenal of the United States, was founded in 1944 to help rebuild Europe. I guess they went through some sort of war. It's not well documented. In the early 50s, at the behest of our ally Britain and what would become British Petroleum, America's CIA overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh in Iran, who sought to nationalize their oil reserves, and installed the Shah in his place, a brutal and easily corrupted dictator. Though successful, there were no misconceptions about the consequences the U.S. could suffer had this campaign been exposed. And the risk of revelations about the CIA's involvement in any similar campaigns to overthrow democracies in the future was considered far too risky. So the US sought a new approach, and in the 60s, they found the solution lied with the very same World Bank. Intelligence agencies like the NSA could identify prospective agents. Then, rather than hiring them, they could get them hired by a multinational that the government and their once virtuous World Bank contract with. This little workaround accomplishes two crucial objectives. Number one, the risk of geopolitical fallout goes to basically zero. Corporations are greedy, everyone says, and the company then weathers some insults. Maybe an attempt at a boycott is made and the company pays a fine. Number two, although the companies hiring these agents would be paid by the taxpayer through the World Bank, the actions of the corporation receiving these payments and their respective agents as non-government entities would now be shielded from congressional oversight and from the public eye. Enter Jim Perkins, the author of the best-selling book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the third edition of which is our primary source for this episode. Through this very recruiting process, Jim found work at a once prestigious, now defunct engineering firm called Chas T. Main. His path to this role went as follows. He was awaiting an imminent draft notice to go fight in Vietnam and didn't want to. Though I hear the heroin was really good on that side of the orb, I wouldn't want to either. A relative of his future ex-wife suggested he go into intelligence as a means of dodging this draft, and he leaped at the opportunity, agreeing to a long, hard probing by the NSA shortly thereafter. A chance encounter introduced Jim to the Peace Corps, also a means of draft deferral, and when he broached the subject to the relative of his future ex-wife, the man was adamant. "Put the NSA on ice, lad. Your future's in Ecuador." So rather than being sent out to the impoverished and war-torn streets of Vietnam, Jim was sent to the impoverished, war-scarred streets of Ecuador. Here, he became bilingual, became ingrained in the community, and familiarized himself with the small country's trials. A VP of the company, Chas T. Main, soon paid a visit to the community where Jim was stationed, and the two struck up a conversation. The man, Einar Graves, told Jim to write him from time to time to give him the download on economic possibilities in the region, and through the letters exchanged, the two became close. Einar, incidentally a colonel in the Army Reserves, eventually brought up the prospect of Jim working for Maine, and when Jim told him he had a job waiting for him at the NSA, Einar explained that he often worked as a liaison, quote-unquote, for the agency, and it was here that Jim began connecting the dots. He decided to work with the company and was told to begin researching Jakarta in Indonesia. While researching the country's economics, he was approached by another affiliate of the firm and was told of the expectations of his position. If you're listening and wondering whether or not the title Economic Hitman is hyperbole being employed by us or Jim Perkins, again, the author of our primary source, here is where we can put that speculation to rest, because here is where the terms of Jim's future employment were categorized explicitly as those of an economic hitman, quote unquote, though the term was chosen in a sort of no one would believe you kind of way. It was explained to Jim that there are four key pillars to any EHM, economic hitman, strategy: fear, debt, anxiety over insufficiency, and divide and conquer. Though by the start of Jim's career, debt was kind of taking the lead over the fear component. The two objectives these pillars were enacted to accomplish were these. First is what I'll call the corporate objective, which I described a little earlier. Jim's role specifically was to go to developing countries and produce studies that provide economic justification for enormous engineering and construction projects, and thus the international loans to build them. These projects would line the pockets of companies like Chas T. Main, like Bechtel, like Halliburton, Stone & Webster, Brown & Root, on and on. The deciding factor of what projects would receive financing was which project generated the greatest boost to gross national product, though crucially, a project could offer huge gains of this sort, but only benefit a single family, leaving the rest of the nation no better off economically, and now saddled with an enormous loan, which segues us nicely into the second objective of the EHM work: bankrupting the countries receiving these loans. Now, mind you, this objective was pursued after payment was received by the U.S. corporations. Now, although heist movies like Ocean's 11 tell one massive lie that those seeking to steal on a large scale attract allies by paying them, in reality, most successful robbery efforts find allies via blackmail, which is what the U.S., like China, sought to do here. A nation, one could speculate, that already benefits from favorable trade deals and partnerships with the U.S. might look for additional favors from the superpower if they are to vote in line with its interests at the UN. In fact, it would behoove that developing country to seek out agreements like this. Meanwhile, that vote is a foregone conclusion when the voter could be thrown into bankruptcy by the U.S. for voting the other way. This goes the same for any resistance by the encumbered nation to allowing the U.S. to establish a military base on their soil or tap into their natural resources. Their cooperation is assured when the alternative is financial destruction and no one has to point a gun anywhere. Now, the challenge with focusing more on the debt pillar than the fear pillar for leverage in these campaigns is this. For the debt thing to work out, you need players and politicians that are ignorant or corruptible, whose interests can be swayed by wealth and consolidated power. For the players like Jim Perkins, you need ambition and willingness to climb the ladder and willingness to put blinders on. And this applies to his entire team during this trip in Jakarta, actually. 10 employees from Chastity, Maine went to the region in total. 8 were engineers there to provide estimates and consult on the feasibility of the large projects Maine hoped to take on for the region, blissfully unaware of their ultimate cost to the Indonesian capital and the country as a whole. One man was the focal point and author of our main source, encouraged to come to the World Bank with bold and exciting forecasts for potential energy loads in Jakarta, ensuring Maine would again secure the largest budget possible to electrify the city's infrastructure. The final man was Howard Parker, considered by others at Chastity, Maine, to be a bitter old man, aware of what these large, useless projects cost these growing nations, and determined to report the energy load that was actually possible for Jakarta. When the two men presented their findings, Howard and Jim Perkins, Howard's much more conservative findings got him fired. Jim's irresponsibly optimistic report, on the other hand, got him promoted, and Maine execs and Indonesian officials cheered him on as their pockets were lined. You see, for the corruptible politicians, the debt trap buried in all of this diploma remains buried. Hi, post-recording, Rat Bill here. The word I was trying to say was diplomacy. Continue shilling for the U.S. So long as you do that, we're not as concerned about late payments here and there. And you get all sorts of nice, shiny new infrastructure, ensuring that should democracy ever prove to be an obstacle, it can be one you overcome. For the incorruptible politicians, these campaigns are more complicated. And remember what we like to say about things being complicated in this podcast. Jaime Roldos was Ecuador's first real reprieve from a string of brutal dictators and years of colonial activity by the U.S. and U.S.-based corporations. He was elected to office on August 10, 1979, and shortly thereafter ordered SIL out of the country. This was a bold move based on a campaign promise to do the very same. You see, the stated mission of the very evangelical American-based SIL, or Summer Institute of Linguistics, was to study, translate, and immortalize the spoken languages of indigenous populations, and the organization had built up a considerable presence in Ecuador while studying the Huarani people. However, many of those familiar with the practices of the SIL began to notice patterns inconsistent with their stated mission. It seemed, allegedly, that the organization's ushering of specific indigenous tribes into missionary reservations was clearing specific sites for drilling by American oil companies. Rumors among Ecuadorian locals of SIL missionaries traversing the region in oil company helicopters abounded. To be clear, there is no evidence of collusion between SIL and Big Oil beyond rumors and coincidence. But even if the two were perfectly unrelated, the ways SIL's work benefited Big Oil, even incidentally, were too great a threat to Roldos's greatest ambition: the successful implementation of his hydrocarbon policy, which targeted Big Oil directly. Now, here's the gist of that policy. Hey, big oil companies, unless we can reach an agreement that benefits the people of Ecuador, the rightful owners of this oil, you're out of here, expelled from the country. This policy initiative undoubtedly drew inspiration from the efforts of Omar Torrijos, who up to that point had spent years fighting to reclaim the war-torn streets of his homestead to create a haven for refugees and those fleeing persecution, and had in the 70s gained real traction in his efforts to reclaim the canal that bore his country's name, Panama. However, Roldos was up against a different administration than Torrijos. Torrijos accomplished what he had while Jimmy Carter was in the White House. And although calls for the U.S. to forfeit the canal had been ringing the Earth's crust like a bell for years, Jimmy Carter was the first president actually willing to ignore the cries of big business and their bootlickers and acknowledge the rest of the planet. With his help, or some would argue complacency, Torrijos and the people he represented ironed out an agreement to take ownership of the canal, and the wealthy lost their fucking minds. In 1981, Ronald Reagan took office. This was the administration backing big oil while Roldos campaigned for his nation's sovereignty. Weeks after sending his bill to Congress for approval and mere days after expelling SIL missionaries, Roldos gave a speech from the Olympic Stadium in Quito, where he touted his ambitions and assured the people of Ecuador that the days of their exploitation at the hands of multinationals were over. He waved goodbye to his people for the last time on May 1st, 1981, and boarded a plane that fell out of the sky hours later, ending his life. Osvaldo Hurtado succeeded Roldos, and by the end of the year, SIL missionaries were back in the country, and a massive new oil drilling program was put into motion, spearheaded by Texaco and the other big internationals. For our listeners in the States, a lot of this might be news, but for the rest of the world, it's apparently a solemn rerun. One reason for it being news for our U.S. listeners could be the widely held belief that our government was responsible for this activity. Even if our government didn't do it, this isn't a fun lesson to teach in history class. Everyone loved this guy, and he was going to save his country, and then he died under very suspicious circumstances, and everything is worse now. Anyways, the whole world thinks we did it. Doesn't inspire patriotism the way that the American education system would prefer. And it would be hard to teach the subject in history while ignoring archived newspapers from across the global South adorned with the words CIA assassination, referencing Roldos' tragic death. Now, despite a deafening chorus of calls for investigations by the U.S. government into the CIA, no investigations ever took place, and months later, Torrijos of Panama would suffer an identical fate, leaving Panama at the hands of the easily corruptible Manuel Noriega. 2 plane crashes in a matter of months, leading to deaths of 2 political leaders, was unusual at this time. It was the 80s. Boeing wasn't littering fields across the U.S. with scrap metal for the savings, so though it's not out of the question, the chance of genuine, coincidental, catastrophic malfunction on 2 different aircraft holding foreign leaders who knew each other and had the same enemies within a span of a few months has to be subatomic. Another explanation is that Roldos wanted to keep big oil from looting his country, and Torrijos was on his way to having the canal rebuilt by Japanese construction companies and financed by Japan, which would A, bar Bechtel, one of the most powerful construction companies in the world, from participating in the bidding process, and B, would mean U.S. debt wouldn't be involved. Less of a chokehold on the canal, you see. Now, the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman makes several references to those the government relies on to carry out dirty work when a foreign leader is truly impossible to corrupt, and it calls these people jackals. In Roldos' case, he already expected future attempts on his life, so when he flew, a decoy plane would typically fly as well. And at the last minute on that night in May of 1981, a member of his security detail convinced him to travel on the decoy plane. Here is your potential jackal. Now, the book is frustratingly vague on the topic of jackals, and I'm guessing that's out of necessity. The author can't just be like, jackals are guys like Seth. He has to cast a wide net to account for the great variety who fill this role. And also to protect his own ass, he reportedly got death threats, a lot of them, while writing the first edition of the book. And those can often be followed by, death. So for these reasons, the furthest the author gets is saying that jackals are CIA assets. As far as we can discern, the one consistency, it seems, is that these people are not expressly affiliated with the CIA. Indeed, their most valuable quality seems to be the air of plausible deniability that comes with their involvement. Often these will be members of local right-wing paramilitaries, ambitious opponents of the target, waiting in the rafters, or just freaky little weirdos on the verge of a mental breakdown. These two men, Roldos and Torrijos, their aspirations, unceremonious deaths, and the ensuing fallout determined the choices and ultimate direction of Rafael Correa from a young age. The influence of the two men and the U.S.'s reputation for these predatory strategies compelled him to investigate the nature of these economic hitman strategies and ultimately to declare the $10 billion debt to the World Bank that was dogging the country so brutally illegitimate. Now, this, unsurprisingly, infuriated the U.S. government and U.S.-based corporations. Standard & Poor's and Fitch Ratings slashed the country's credit score as a means of bringing the country's small economy to its knees and sending a message to other nations at the mercy of U.S. foreign policy. Fuck around, find out. Thus, as a means of survival, Correa made the decision to fortify economic bonds with a distant body instead of Ecuador's neighbor to the north. It was a solution he invented, and it was his only solution. Accepting money from China immediately restored Ecuador's credit rating. He was a hero. However, the only choice available to him was still devastating long term. Regardless of the stated intentions, China, just like the US, is a global superpower, likely on its way to being the global superpower. But superpowers do not form cooperatives. Though the narrative peddled by China to the rest of the world, as it expands, differs from that of the United States in that it's crafted and intentional, the narrative we as citizens have always been told is near identical to what China is likely telling its people. America has been a global superpower for the better part of 80 years, a supposed beacon of hope and a place where people go to make something of themselves. Before World War II, the nation was rigidly isolationist. But after getting bombed for selling weapons to allies, the way it was taught when I was young was that America took on a paternal role, getting involved wherever they saw fit after the war to ensure peace was maintained and prosperity was within reach for all. In reality, the U.S. had become a global superpower, thriving as a result of all that served or was sucked into its sphere of influence. An economic and geopolitical body piloted and governed by the rules it chooses, and thus forced to see other countries as belonging to the world below. When its influence brought it to the front door of developing nations, it was not to help develop those nations into sovereign superpowers themselves. The U.S. was not breeding competitors. The U.S. did this sort of work that China is doing now because the U.S. was a gigantic, indifferent, vacuous behemoth, completely calloused to the impact it had on those it touches, simply hungry. I don't think it's hard to look at the U.S. today and see a nation in decline, but that doesn't mean those predatory policies have subsided. As a global superpower eats, it shrinks like a black hole. Once upon a time in America, as in China today, most were rising out of poverty. There was a horribly oppressed minority that the rest of the world knew about, but effectively chose to ignore for the sake of preserving relations with the U.S. Medicine was affordable, and so was education, though the latter wasn't necessary to keep a roof over your head. Alas, though, the beast shrank within its own borders and thus began feeding upon its own people. Today, most Americans are victims, at a smaller scale, obviously, of the very same debt traps the United States set for its victim countries like Jakarta, Iran, Ecuador, Panama, and Chile. To save the world from this trend, Jim Perkins, the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, finishes his third edition by suggesting a bunch of corporate forward initiatives like B Lab's B Corp program, which, if you've listened to our Nestle series, you know how we feel about that. Instead, allow us to suggest the following. Join a union. Unionize at work, unionize among fellow tenants, and boycott. Despite the size of these companies, boycott is possible, and it is damn effective if you can pull it off. If you can't boycott a specific company, consider borrowing, quote unquote, their goods instead of buying them. And lastly, if you've got the stones, protest, protest, protest. Thanks for listening. We hope you like it. If you think we're cool and good, consider subscribing. It really friggin' helps us, and we'll love you for it. Also, hey, want to talk? Pop by our subreddit. We're on there. The thing is in the episode description. Go look at it. Got episode ideas? Hi. Email us. We'd love to hear them or any suggestions you have for the show. I love you, and Money Mike loves you, and goodbye.